I'm Carla Pecoraro.
I'm Anne Woolfield.
And I'm Mel Akerman, and we're your hosts of the Uterine Sound podcast, bringing you up-to-date information on all things O&G. It is time for another episode of Evidence with Anne, where we will discuss some of the RANZCOG landmark trials. Today's trials are about the role of progesterone in preventing preterm birth and include 2 studies by Fonseca et al. Specifically, they look at the use of vaginal progesterone in preventing preterm birth in 2 different population groups. Firstly, those at increased risk of preterm birth, and secondly, those with a short cervix.
Wait, what? Aren't there heaps of trials relating to progesterone therapy? There's only 2 I need to memorize? That's amazing!
There are so many trials relating to progesterone in the prevention of preterm birth. It must be one of the most researched areas in obstetrics. But although there are so many trials, there is so little time. So to keep today's episode nice and short and easy to listen to, we're only going to cover the essential RANZCOG landmark trials. Okay, Anne, take it away.
The landmark trials relative to progesterone therapy in the prevention of preterm birth include prophylactic administration of progesterone by vaginal suppository to reduce the incidence of spontaneous preterm birth in women at increased risk, a random placebo-controlled, randomised, double-blind controlled trial, and progesterone and the risk of preterm birth among women with a short cervix.
These are some of the first trials published in relation to the use of vaginal progesterone in the prevention of preterm birth. There have obviously been so many more studies and meta-analyses and Cochrane reviews since then, but because these are our landmark trials, we wanted to give them some special attention. We'll cover some of the more recent trials in one of our future episodes. And tell me more.
The first trial we'll discuss is called Prophylactic Administration of Progesterone by Vaginal Suppository to Reduce the Incidence of Spontaneous Preterm Birth in Women at Increased Risk, a randomised, placebo-controlled, double-blind study. It was written by Fonseca et al., published in the AJOG, which is the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. It was published in 2003, and the study period covered 1996 to 2001. This was a single-centre trial conducted in Brazil. The aim of the study was to evaluate the effect of vaginal progesterone in preventing preterm birth in a high-risk population.
In a high-risk population. Well, that sounds like it needs more of an explanation. For this study, the definition of a high-risk population included at least one of a previous preterm birth, a previous prophylactic cerclage, or a uterine anomaly.
I think it's time for some buzzwords. Let's get into the methodology. But first, time for a quick recap. Prophylactic administration of progesterone by vaginal suppository to reduce the incidence of spontaneous preterm birth in women at increased risk. A randomised, placebo-controlled, double-blind study. It was published in 2003 by Fonseca in the AJOG. What was the setting again, Anne?
It was in Brazil. Mel, can you tell me what they actually did in this trial?
Buzzword time. This was a single-center, double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trial. 142 singleton pregnancies at high risk of preterm birth were randomized to either 100 milligram progesterone vaginal pessary every night from 24 to 34 weeks or placebo. There were 72 in the intervention group and 70 in the placebo group. Exclusion criteria included multiple pregnancy and fetal anomaly.
The primary outcome was delivery prior to 37 weeks gestation. Secondary outcomes included preterm uterine contractions monitored with an external tocodynamometer or admission and tocolysis for preterm labour.
Wait, what? They had their contractions monitored with an external tocodynamometer? Is that a dinosaur?
I have no idea. Yeah, so look, they needed a way to quantify preterm uterine contractions. So in this study, all pregnant women had their contractions monitored with an external tocodynamometer once a week for 60 minutes. A positive test was if there were 4 or more contractions per hour before 30 weeks gestation, or 6 or more per hour from 30 weeks onwards.
Oh, that's one way to do it. All right, I'm dying to know, what did the study find?
There was a 21% reduction in the preterm birth rate in the vaginal progesterone group. No surprises there. In the intervention group, the rate of preterm birth were less than 37 weeks was 13.8%, but 28.5% in the placebo group, with a p-value of 0.03. There was also a reduction in the preterm birth rate of less than 34 weeks in the progesterone group, 2.8% versus 18.6%, with a p-value of 0.002. There was also a decrease in the uterine activity in the progesterone group, 23.6% versus 54.3%. There was no significant difference in admissions for threatened preterm labour.
Right, team, we spoke about repetition in our studying episode, so we have to do it. And I want the who, what, when, where, and why. So, prophylactic administration of progesterone by vaginal suppository to reduce the incidence of spontaneous preterm birth in women at increased risk. A randomised placebo-controlled double-blind study. It was published when?
2003 by Fonseca in the AJOG.
Who?
142 singleton women at increased risk of preterm birth. Remember, patients were classified as at high risk if they had a previous preterm birth, a cervical cerclage, or a uterine malformation.
Where?
Brazil, a single centre in Brazil.
And how?
Okay, so it was a double-blind, placebo-controlled RCT with either 100 milligrams of vaginal progesterone or placebo.
And what did they find?
Vaginal progesterone reduced the rate of preterm birth by 21%.
Amazing. All right, Anne, let's talk strengths and limitations.
The strength of this study included the design. However, it was a small study, and I guess we know now that this is one of the first RCTs at looking at vaginal progesterone, and since then there's been quite a few much larger studies. It was single centre, and even though it included kind of a broad-ish definition at those at risk of preterm birth, 97% in the placebo and 90% in the progesterone group had a previous history of preterm birth. There was not many in the groups with the cerclage or the uterine anomaly. This does mean that there's a slightly difference between the intervention and the control groups. The analysis also excluded those with preterm or medically indicated preterm birth. So this was not an intention to treat analysis, which is usually the preferred method for randomized control trials. Although I'm not sure if there's any particular reasoning why the authors or the statisticians thought this was a better method for analysis. If those patients weren't excluded, then there would not have been a statistically significant result.
Okay, I guess there needs to be a few researchers brave enough to start these small RCTs. All right, what is the next trial by Fonseca et al.? Just as promising?
Yes. Our next landmark trial, progesterone and the risk of preterm birth among women with a short cervix. A much shorter and much easier trial title to remember.
What else? What's the difference?
Well, as the title explains, the aim of this study was to evaluate the effectiveness of vaginal progesterone in preventing preterm birth in those with a short cervix at mid-gestation, rather than just those at high risk of preterm birth. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2007. Similar to the other trial by Fonseca et al., it was a double-blind, placebo-controlled RCT. In contrast, it was multi-centre across 3 countries, and it was conducted between 2003 and 2006.
So who was included in this trial if it wasn't those at high risk?
Impressively, over 24,000 women were screened with transvaginal cervical length in the mid-trimester. Those with a cervix of less than or equal to 15 millimetres, a total of 413 women, were randomised to take placebo or 200 milligrams of vaginal progesterone daily at night.
Did they have the same primary outcome?
Unfortunately, no, making it slightly more difficult to remember. The primary outcome in this study was preterm delivery less than 34 weeks. Secondary outcomes included birth weight, fetal or neonatal death, major adverse outcomes, which included intraventricular hemorrhage, respiratory distress syndrome, necrotizing enterocolitis, retinopathy of prematurity, and NICU admission.
Okay, Carla, let's do what we do best. Copy everything that Anne just said. What was the trial?
Progesterone and the risk of preterm birth among women with a short cervix.
When did they do it?
2007 by Fonseca et al. In the New England Journal of Medicine.
Who was in the trial?
413 women with a short cervix less than 15 millimetres.
And how did they do it?
It was a double-blind, placebo-controlled RCT conducted in multiple centres. It randomised women with a cervix less than 15 millimetres at mid-trimester to either 200 milligrams of vaginal progesterone or placebo. The primary outcome was preterm birth less than 34 weeks.
And finally, what were the results?
Once again, I'm sure these results aren't surprising. Prophylactic vaginal progesterone was associated with a reduction in preterm birth less than 34 weeks, 19.2 versus 34.4%, with a relative risk of 0.56 and a 95% confidence interval of 0.36 to 0.86. There was a non-significant reduction in neonatal morbidity with a p-value of 0.17. And as we're aware from our discussion of cervical length screening in our preterm birth episode, those with a short cervix are more likely to go into preterm labour less than 34 weeks. So in this study, those with a transvaginal cervical length of less than or equal to 15 millimetres had an incidence of preterm birth of 34%. Those with a mid-trimester transvaginal cervical length of between 16 to 25 millimetres had an incidence of spontaneous preterm birth of 5%.
Oh, great. So there was a reduction in the rate of preterm birth less than 34 weeks in those with 200 milligrams of vaginal progesterone at night compared with placebo. In those with a mid-trimester short cervix of less than 15 millimetres.
And what do you like about this study?
I like the study design, obviously. It was also multi-centre, which improves its generalisability. It was a relatively small study, so there weren't that many women who actually ended up having a cervix less than 15 millimetres. And because of this, there wasn't enough power to detect differences in secondary outcomes. But there was, obviously, a huge number of women screened, which is great.
Yeah, that's a good point. And are we going to discuss the other trials for progesterone?
Not today, Kyla. We briefly mentioned a few in our preterm birth episodes. There's just too many to cover. But these are the two RANZCOG Langmuir trials we need to know in more detail.
But don't forget, we will have another episode where Anne goes into the latest trials.
Stop signing me up for all these episodes I need to write.
It's important. Well, thank you so much, Anne. I feel like these trials are coming back to my memory after they have escaped my brain since exam time. Thank you for the reminder. And thanks for listening to The Uterine Sound. Be sure to check us out on Instagram at The Uterine Sound, email us at theuterinesound@gmail.com, or check out our website, theuterinesound.com. Let us know if you have any questions, queries, or if you want to fact check Anne. Don't fact check me and Carla. Anne is the knowledge guru.